Earlier, I spoke with Phyllis Bennis from the Institute for Policy Studies. She talked about the delay of the Bagram handover and said the U.S. should leave Afghanistan as soon as possible.
You know, I think this is very much an indication of the fact that the war, the U.S. war in Afghanistan, is simply not over. The U.S. is not giving up control. The issue has been the refusal of the United States government to make good on this claim that they want to turn over power and authority in the prison to the Afghan government. They said, well, we want you to be in control, except we want a veto on who you release. We want to make sure that you keep people without trial. We don't want you to send some people to trial. You know, it's a very tricky business here. And the Afghan government, of course, has its own problems with the legacy of torture in the prisons, but the U.S. does as well. So the idea that the U.S. stands there and says, we're worried about torture, which they're not saying at the moment, but they have in other occasions, becomes a very hypocritical kind of claim. The U.S. is fighting for the right to keep people imprisoned indefinitely without trial, based on a U.S. judgment that they are permanent dangers to the U.S. troops that are ostensibly leaving. So it's a very complicated kind of disagreement, but the ultimate component is they don't want to give control to the Afghans.
Well, basically, isn't the United States saying, look, we're not sure that someone isn't going to be released, you really shouldn't be released? And isn't the Afghan forces saying, well, you have some innocent people in there?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is the Afghans are saying you have innocent people, which may or may not be true. Part of the problem is the U.S. notion that it has better intelligence than the Afghan government is a little bit specious. They're relying on translators, they're relying on interpreters. Very few in the U.S. armed forces actually speak the language. They're relying on other people's assessments of who is at risk, who is a danger for the future. So it becomes a little, you know, crazy for the U.S. to be saying that. On the other hand, we also have a situation where the Afghans themselves are trying to both release innocent people, but probably they want to release some Taliban-connected people in order to move forward on the possibility of peace talks with the Taliban. So the Afghan government has its own reasons for wanting to keep fewer people in prison. The U.S. position is, put them all in prison, throw away the key, keep them forever, and we'll have peace talks anyway. The problem is you can't have it both ways. If you lock up everybody you think is connected to the Taliban, who are you going to talk to?
What has to happen then for this all to work? Does the United States need to just step back and let it happen and then just kind of let the cards fall where they...
Well, I think, first of all, the U.S. has to be clear that only by getting all its troops and all of its U.S.-paid contractors or mercenaries or whatever we want to call them out of the country is there any chance for Afghans to be able to begin the process, which is going to be a very difficult process, of rebuilding their country. Their country has been shredded by these years, these decades now of war. The U.S. war most recently, of course, but the earlier wars as well. And there's never been an opportunity to rebuild on Afghan terms. The U.S. efforts, as we're seeing now in Iraq, the U.S. effort to, it spent $60 billion in supposedly building up Iraq, and it turns out the whole thing was a complete failure. It's failing equally or worse in Afghanistan. So what has to happen is all the U.S. troops have to get out. All of the NATO troops have to get out. The war has to be ended. Now, is that going to lead to Afghanistan becoming Switzerland? Of course not. The U.S. is leaving behind an enormous legacy that includes enormous levels of violence, divisions in the country which didn't exist before. But the Afghans themselves are the ones who are going to have to deal with that, and they're going to have to do it on a regional basis, which means they're going to have to deal with the Taliban, they're going to have to deal with Pakistan, they're going to have to deal with Iran, they're going to have to deal with all their neighbors, with all the countries in the region. The U.S. is 8,000 miles away. We don't belong there. We don't belong there, and we're not helping the situation. We're making it worse.
All right, Phyllis Bennis, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.